Hello, everybody. We're back again with another episode of Unfolding the Soul. Um, Today, my guest is Nick. Um, I've met him on Discord, and he's been part of my journey in the early days. And then he retreated into his modern day hermit style way of being, where he's now more sporadically found on the internet. And I had the good fortune to catch him, and he wanted to participate. And so he's going to talk about his journey with his discovery of spirituality, because he's had a lot of stuff happen in his life, like you can see in the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server YouTube channel. There's a whole set of things where he did talk about his experiences with cults, and I bet we get some snippets of that as well today. So yeah, Nick, what was where did spirituality enter your life?
Well, it's pretty interesting. I grew up as a kid as like the most nominal Christian on one side of the family. My parents divorced when I was an infant. So I always kind of had two separate worldviews depending on which parent I was with at the time. One of which was deeply atheistic, the other was so nominally Christian that they couldn't, quote a single line out of the Bible. Um, and had, as far as I know, never gone to church. And yeah, I was very young. I kind of chose the atheistic side of the coin, and largely went through the um, you know uh, teenage atheistic phase where I was the smartest person to ever exist and could see the ridiculousness of every system of beliefs in the world.
So the
And
hubris was where you went into the atheistic side for?
um, I mean, what actually triggered it, because I was very young, so it wasn't hubris out the gate. It was it was actually fear around eternal life.
Mm.
So I was very young, riding in the car, a long car trip, and my uncle, who was the only one in the family that knew anything about the religion, was answering some of my questions. And it got to his description of heaven, which was, very simplistic, uh, fairly standard. You live eternally and everyone you love is there, and this type of image. And that night, when I went to fall asleep, I was stuck in this existential terror. I was like 7, maybe 8 at the time, and couldn't fall asleep just trying to picture this concept of eternal life. And it was shortly after that I basically just rejected, it fell to that atheistic side of the coin. And then as I got older and, you know, kind of did my own investigations, I definitely became the Sam Harris type of atheist, if you will. And very much a physical reductionist. Everything could be explained with physics, and there were no mysteries to the universe other than its own deceptions on itself. And that continued until I was about 17 or 18. Um, it was kind of around that age that I had started accumulating enough experiences that weren't able to be contextualized in such a ridiculous worldview that I slowly started kind of like investigating, and I went really the atheistic route, which is to say, I started with Buddhism because of how friendly it is to an atheistic worldview, particularly as we describe it to ourselves in the West. and I started meditating and trying to, in some sense, gain some control over these experiences. Um, and it was not much longer after that, maybe another year, where I came across um, Joseph Campbell primarily, and Carl Jung, and I was able to start looking at the world's religions from this kind of mythic lens, and that's where I kind of got my foot in the door with the whole situation, where I stopped um, contextualizing everything from just this physicalism and started moving into that narrative um, manner in which people were able to pass wisdom down through their traditions as opposed to just knowledge, and started trying to look at religions through that way. Granted, I was still very bitter against Christianity, probably just because was raised in it and kind of formed my early worldview in contrast against it. So it was much more comfortable for me to look at Hinduism or, older European mythologies, whether it was Roman or Greek, or even with the tiny amount of information we have about, uh, primitive Celtic religions,
So
stuff like that.
was this a purely an intellectual pursuit, or was there also a participatory shift in your
There was
being?
a pretty dramatic participatory shift. I would say it definitely, well, actually, I'm not even sure if it started as intellectual, because the impetus to even like open up out of that initial worldview was like I could not contextualize the emotions I was experiencing because they just didn't fit in that really simplistic worldview. Um, I would say it definitely, there was a lot of aspects of the intellectualism later, but at the same time, it's kind of like my entire trajectory in life had shifted at that point. When I was a teenager, I was like dead certain I was going to be a scientist or a mathematician. I was always very gifted in mathematics when I was young. And around that, 18-year-old mark, it just wildly swung in a different direction.
Yeah, so you got dragged along by your experience instead of that you opened the door.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, I mean, it really was a pretty radical shift in how I contextualized life. I went from having a fairly clear trajectory to a really unclear one, much more exploratory. And, around that age, I started traveling a lot. I started going out of my way trying to design a life that I thought was going to lead to a healthier balance between what a human was and the rest of the world, which I did not find in the modern way of living. So I started going, pretty far out into remote areas. I was trying to come up with skills, things I could do for a job that didn't require me to, um, kind of live the normal life that was, in some sense, more naturally laid out.
So that sounds like you found your second rebellion. First, you
Yeah,
rebel against Christianity, and then you rebel against intellectualism.
right. Yeah, yeah. It's a good theme. I have these. It's kind of funny because I feel like I'm generally quite a stable person
Mm-hmm.
until I like remember my life. But there's definitely these. There's definitely these points where I go just like I've found this nice little pocket of stability and I kind of know what I'm doing. and then my entire worldview shatters at once, and then I just go flying off in some crazy direction. Um,
It's
I'm not
almost
sure.
sounds like you're on this hinge point, and you're putting so much pressure, and then it's like it slips or it breaks, and it's like bam, and you need to
Yeah,
re.
that's exactly how it seems. And the goofiest part about that is it seems exactly correct, and yet that pressurizing period is so dull.
Mm,
Like it's not an exciting pressurizing. It's not like I can even really feel the weight of it until it gives. And then suddenly I can see how much I was like kind of forcing myself into a particular structure, which I suppose, there's probably an aspect there that's I find desirable in a weird way. It's kind of that freedom that comes from deconverting from a worldview, and then right immediately after the that great feeling of freedom comes just like the existential terror of like not knowing what anything is.
So I get this image that you're in a mold, right? And your reference is the mold, and you're just like squeezing yourself into the mold. And you're like, oh, everything is going fine because I'm like in relationship to the mold. And you're like, oh, there's something outside the mold.
Right. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Right. And then yeah, it is. It's like, oh, how exciting. There's all this other stuff. And then immediately followed by, oh, there's all this other stuff. Um, yeah, yeah. It's definitely been a cycle in my life. The time in between big bursts has definitely grown as I get older. It's longer gaps. I'm able to stay in these stable positions for longer. And I do feel like, to some degree as well, every time it happens, I get a bit closer to a mold that doesn't require quite as much pressure
Mhm.
to hold me closer to its shape.
So what if you flip it, right? Instead of making really long, big molds, you break your mold every day, right? Like breathing, like it's.
So I did try this. This really, I mean, it's actually kind of funny. This was the main draw. There's several ways to approach. This was the main draw of the fourth cult I participated in, the one that I actually chose and knew was a cult.
Mhm.
The others were more like I showed up somewhere and they were like, "Hey, this is a cult," uh, and then it blew up after a couple weeks or whatever. But this last one of the main aspects, and this was writing off a very intense, for lack of a better word, spiritual or I guess transformative experience, um, which was also my turn towards Christianity. Um,
Yeah, so maybe we
where
should focus on that aspect a little bit, right? So you're discovering all of the spirituality, and you're getting blasted.
yes, yeah. So okay, we'll do a quick run catch up to this other area, just for I think the con. Oh my gosh, cat! It's probably useful to run through. So went to backpacking through Europe the summer after high school. I was 18. I was 18 at the time. Went there for 4 months, came back, got a job back at the coffee shop I was working at before I left. Met a buddy there who's still one of my best friends. And the following summer, we took off to the big island of Hawaii. Um, this is where I ran into Colt 1, by the way, 1 and 2. Um, Met a girl there. We ended up coming back to the mainland, to Washington State. And about a year into our relationship, she went crazy, like real, not like Um, not
Not the
wow, this chick is
acceptable kind.
crazy, but like no, she actually went insane. A mixture of schizophrenia and bipolar. And I was watching this transition from this, totally wonderful, nice person, if a bit of a weird one, to full on psychosis. And the way that uh, happened was through all these kind of new age spiritual ideas. Um, many of which provided by me, many of which provided by her, and we were kind of cobbling together some goofy worldview. And then as it got more extreme, it mostly just became this rapid adaptive network of like trying to explain whatever random thing she was experiencing in that moment and trying to make sense of it on the fly. Um, one to ground her to try and like reduce some of that mania, and two, so that I was
Do
able to
you,
ground some of it out. Because when you're around someone like that, we were living in the woods. There was like no one around us.
mhm.
We were in a 1 bedroom cabin. So when you're around someone like that for that much time, it definitely has an effect on your sense of reality. It becomes really hard to stay in a stable, your own stable mindset when you don't have all these other networks of people kind of like reinforcing what's real to you. And
So
schizophrenics' worldviews are really overpowering. Like
mhm.
there's so much energy behind them. And if you don't have that huge kind of network to absorb some of that energy, and you're just getting blasted by their mania,
Mhm.
it does feel like it just overpowers your sense of reality. At
So
least it
so
did to me.
do you feel like a person can be the grounding for such a person, or is that just a fool's errand?
um I think it can, but I think when it's in such a um self there's a word for it, I can't remember the word, self-taught manner, right? This
Hmm.
fluid manner, you're not able to spread it out over larger groups of people that are having like experiences and are able to guide you because they went through something similar, or all these other aspects. um Autodidactical was the word I was trying to think of. It Your attempt to ground and how rapidly it changes almost starts creating a meta. I hate that word, but it fits here. A meta insecurity, right? You might feel grounded in the moment because you kind of were able to run it through these processes. However, the part of you that's watching you go through all these processes is going, ooh, something's not, there's no consistency here. Something's not fitting together, right? It's too adaptive. And in some sense, right, to use an image from Peterson, the layers in the hierarchy are disconnected from each other, and you start
Hmm.
perceiving that, and then it starts creating an existential insecurity. I would
Yeah.
say.
So the association I got was also Peterson, him talking about the people in the prison camps having to carry sacks of salt across the camp and back, right? Without
Right,
meaning. Like I
right,
got
right.
that sense.
That's kind of, yeah. Well, you're grounded, right? Quite literally. But yeah, so part of you goes, why the hell am I carrying the salt back and forth? Um, yeah. So that was a big one, and after that, I definitely went into a pretty major depressive period for about 2 years. Um, didn't end well, but it also didn't end like in the worst. It could have gone a lot worse. It was an ugly situation, but it worked itself out just with us going different ways.
So yeah, what type of depression is this? Is this like real dark, bad feeling, or is it apathy? Like where did you go?
It was definitely, it felt like a weighted depression. It wasn't just like I don't care about anything. It had a feeling, a heaviness, almost somberness. There was definitely like that I didn't know how to do something meaningful, partially too. Like when you go through those extreme experiences, normal life just doesn't feel very um
Stimulating?
energizing, I guess, exciting. Like it's not giving you much. You're
Mm-hmm.
used to like
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of,
that's the
I would
thing that
imagine like,
soldiers go through, right? And when they come back and then they have to
right,
readjust back.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's probably, now that I'm saying it, it was probably something um akin to a lighter trauma response.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um so yeah, I kind of just floated on like that for a couple years after that relationship without much change, just kind of going to work, going home. I had a
The
couple
millstone
friends who
around your neck, like.
yes, yeah. A lot of it was just kind of like, all right, I'll just hunker down and like wait it out.
Hmm.
Um, and then what actually ended up working great for me was I just kind of was like, let me go do something I wanted to try, which was for me rock climbing. And they had just opened a gym in the town I was living in. So one day I was like, well, screw it. Let's go see if this is any fun. And I became obsessed with it. I met a lot of people, a lot of friends. I started going on these, rock climbing trips. We go camping for 4 or 5 days and go climb on rocks and have a good time. And that all like really pulled me kind of back up to a normal, healthy baseline. Um, and it was also at that time that I got diabetes, like a few months after I started rock climbing, maybe half a year.
Do you feel a connection, or is that just random?
I actually feel the connection was with that extreme depressive period that
Mm.
led up to um, that. And by the time I was starting to like do something that made me feel better for myself, it was in some sense a little too late. The damage had been done.
Mm.
um, yeah. So where were we? Oh, we were aiming for Cult 4,
Well,
heading towards Christianity.
yes, the Christianity was the big transformation that you had, right? Because like where are we at with our spiritual life at this point? Like, is the spiritual
So
life in the rock climbing, or?
it's there is none. It
Mm.
was, I still had these kind of ideas. It was kind of a vague new age sense of spirituality. I still had all these mythic systems, but at that point, it was definitely like I had gotten blown out on the overexposure to playing in those realms, and I just wanted to like have fun grabbing things really hard. Like it was very much just like let's, just kind of live life a little, with less of the theory about what life is and what it means. And yeah, right after getting diabetes, I moved here where I'm currently at in Santa Cruz, California. And that was a bit tricky, because I lost my friend group, but at the same time, when I was in Washington, I was living with my dad, and we never got along particularly well when I was living with him. Like we get along great so long as I'm not living with or, too close. Um, so that had built up a number of pressures, and I just felt like I needed to get out of that area. There was still like a lot of environmental triggers that would kind of throw me back into those depressive periods, and the option to come down here was there, so I took it. And yeah, still wasn't. I think what it was that kind of got me back on the spiritual train was I ended up getting a job with a jewelry company that was basically made all its money in the festival circuits. So here in, well, pretty much the entire US, they went everywhere, but specifically some of the ones in California, you have these music festivals that are very spiritually oriented, or at least they paint themselves as that. And this company was very deeply involved in all that, and even the product that they sold was, you know, uh, being marketed with all this kind of new age language and like the meaning of the stones and what the thing represented and all this stuff. Uh, but it was a great job. Like I really had a lot of fun working there for the first couple years, and it was a good group of people. The people that actually worked in the workshop were like way more down to earth, grounded people. Usually, you have to be to make physical objects. Whereas then, you'd get these wild people coming in where their entire life was just based around partying at these festivals. And they would kind of come in and go out. We'd hear all the stories and have fun conversations, but it was never the focus of that job. And so I kind of got back into that, yeah, that whole group through that job, and it kind of kicked back in these, all this new age spiritual learning I'd done before. And at that time, I'd had enough distance to it. It felt like a period where I was starting to reintegrate a lot of what I learned in those earlier years with the crazy ex-girlfriend and that all of that stuff. I was trying to pull the valuable bits back out of it and slowly work them back into my life.
Can you describe that a little bit, how that process goes?
Yeah. Well, a lot of it was I knew how to have the conversations, and now I was surrounded by people that talked in the same language that I used then. And a lot of these people were doing a lot of psychedelic drugs. So they were kind of always in these,
exploratory,
pretty out there states, and they would often try and describe them to you when they got back.
Oh, okay.
And then I would be basically in much the same way I did for the Crazy Ex, like trying to hear their experiences and contextualize them and, go through that process. And it kind of like brought back some of the skills and processes I had learned back then, but in a way that was like a lot safer. It wasn't like life or death. It was just some goofy hippie telling me about their psychedelic experience, right? It didn't have as heavy of a connotation, which made it easier to kind of integrate those experiences back in. But it was very similar in many ways, and just being able to have conversations in that way again without it, feeling overly dramatic, I suppose. Yeah, so that kind of continued on, and then eventually I went to one of the festivals. They sent me on one, and kind of this whole image I had about what I thought I was participating in. So, you hear all the stories, you see the people, you hear all these stories of growth and how much fun everyone's having. And I kind of built up this image that I wasn't even quite aware of, that, something cool was going on here. Like people were really trying to like, be better people, and they were, spiritual but not religious, and they were actually finding systems that worked to create spiritual growth minus the religious dogma and all that. And the moment I actually went to a festival, that entire image, again, the mold exploded. And what I saw was basically people using pseudo spiritual language to rationalize every god awful thing you could imagine. Um, it was like the worst parts of cliques in high schools mixed with holier than thou pseudo spirituality mixed with extreme narcissism and abuses that come from people's inability to hold their boundaries in place while on enormous amounts of drugs. And all of that mixed together in just one big stinking pile of like decent music, I suppose. A stinking pile of decent music. Um, so that was pretty dramatic. And I actually have a great story that I feel like was the perfect microcosm for this whole situation. So I was one night at this festival, and it's tricky, right? Because I had a lot of fun when I went there. It was just worldview destroying at the same time. It's not like it wasn't fun, but yeah. One night I was working at the stand selling the jewelry we made, and really had to go to the bathroom, specifically number 2. And it was dark out, and I'm pretty unfamiliar with the proper, like, you know, normally people that do these things a lot, they always tell you bring your own toilet paper because the chance that they're going to have toilet paper is very low. And always make sure to bring a headlamp with you because there's no lights where all the porta potties are. So not knowing any of this, I'm like beelining it for a freaking porta potty because I'm having some difficulty. And most of them are closed. And then the few that are open, there's no toilet paper in them. Mm-hmm. So finally I find one, and it's super dim, and you could see the toilet paper roll because it's white. And it was just like the faintest, image you could like make out that there was something there. So I found one, it had toilet paper in it. I sit down right into a pile of somebody's shit that they had missed the toilet and took a crap on the rim of the toilet. So I sit right in this. I do my business fully knowing now at this point, like, oh my God. So I'm like trying to clean it up. Thankfully, at our camp, we had like a little makeshift sink. So I'm like back behind the place where we're selling jewelry to people with like these crowds of people. And I'm like back there trying to wash my freaking butt from where I sat in someone else's crap.
Did you steal the toilet roll?
I didn't. I took a lot of it, but and of course it made perfect sense. The only reason that was the only stall that had toilet paper was because everyone else could see the giant pile of crap on it. It was like, oh, I'm not using that one. But the image was quite accurate, right? I had found myself in this position of having sat in someone else's crap. And then I'm sitting there having to clean it off of me. That's what the entire, right? It was one of those things where the symbol was so poignant in the micro. And then the moment I zoomed out, I'm like, oh man, that's what happened. I sat in someone else's crap, and now I'm having to go through all this effort to like wash it off of me.
Mm-hmm. Is this referring to the festival or to your relationship?
The festival, just like the whole New Age scene itself, was very much like what you're picking up from these pseudo gurus. And it doesn't mean that there aren't like really cool people in those scenes. There definitely is. It's just the way the general culture processes it. Here, maybe this is a fun one. Do you know who Bhagavan Das is?
Nope.
He was the teacher of Ram Dass, or I don't know if teacher's the right word. He traveled with Ram Dass in India in the 60s. And Ram Dass is a pretty well-known, 60s New Ager. He brought a lot of people into Hinduism way back in the day. Robert Alpert is his real name. Richard Alpert. Bhagwan Das. So Richard Alpert writes this book describing their time in India, and he basically has just got the most rose-colored tinted glasses on about Ram Dass, right? Just thinks Bhagwan Das. He just thinks he's the coolest fucking dude that ever existed, and he's watching him like walk through India, and every town they go into, all the yogis and mystics like invite him in, and they're like, "Oh, you're here." They have a great time. They're doing a bunch of drugs on the side while they like wander around India.
Sounds like my trip.
So you get this image of Bhagwan Das as just like the most enlightened white guy wandering around in India. And later, Bhagwan Das writes his own book describing that period of time, and it's totally different. And you find out that after literally wandering around in India for years, he comes back and becomes a literal used cars salesman. Right?
Well, you got the skills, that's for sure.
Right. And I was just, it was that thing where it's like, wow, there's no more poignant image in the world than these white guys going around finding used cars, used spiritual vehicles, right? In Buddhism, the Mahayana and the oh gosh, I forget the other one. They're literally called vehicles, right? The big vehicle and the small vehicle. Finding these used spiritual vehicles, coming back to the West, and then trying to sell these used spiritual vehicles, largely devoid of everything that makes them work in the place where they found them. So it was a kind of a symbol like that, where something just lines up a little too perfectly to describe a situation you find yourself in. That was the image I got that night of sitting in someone else's crap, while very desperate to go myself as well, right?
It's almost like a spiritual experience.
It really was. Ironically, it really, I mean, that was a transformative experience. As uncomfortable as it was and as ridiculous as it was in the moment, that was like the trigger point. That was the break, right? It was like I could write off the grossness of this festival experience because there was so many parts where I was having a lot of fun, and then it was like that one moment kind of like kicked it over into the other edge.
Is it also like being filthy allowed you to look at the filth?
What was that? Oh, yeah, in some sense. Well, it's just like, it's not even like, it's like I had no choice but to look at the filth. I had no choice but to go, wash my ass in that sink. It's I don't get to pretend or like just have dirty feet.
Yeah, but
it's like, oh, I got dirty feet, whatever. It's not a big deal. But when it gets closer to your body, it's like, oh, I have to deal with this now. I don't.
Yeah, but it's also an allowance, right? Like it's like now it's okay to look at all the other dirty stuff because you're very
right. That's very true. Yeah, it was. It's like I can admit it to myself that this actually is as gross as I was perceiving but ignoring.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And following that, I went into a pretty intense pseudo-manic period. And I think a lot, it was, I really like Peterson's description of burning off the dead wood, because that's how it felt. This worldview, and in some sense, this was the same worldview I had dealing with the Crazy Ex, Right. And instead of burning the worldview off back then, I went into that depressive period where I just kind of like hunkered down. I didn't
Yeah,
release it,
I get the word repressive now in my
Right,
head.
right. Very accurate. Yeah, in its hyphenated form, even. Um, yeah, repress, reform again. um, so I entered into this burning off the dead wood state. And when you burn wood, specifically dry, old, dead wood, it produces a lot of heat. And I think that's often missed in the descriptions of burning off the dead wood. It's very hot, you're in largely, there's a definite manic aspect to it.
It's high signal, right? Like it's the contrast, yeah. And there's a
Right.
physicality to that as well, right? Yeah.
For me, it was extremely physical. Um, and so I was quite literally having these states, I guess you could call them mystical states, but it felt like I was seeing too deeply into the world around me, and I had no way to get rid of the energy, right? So, and this was like literal nervous energy, like neurons and the nervous system firing off at
Float chakras.
extremely accelerated. Yeah, yeah. And that
Yeah.
was like the burning, right? The
Mm-hmm.
foliage on my nervous system tree was definitely on fire.
Yeah. What is it?
So go ahead.
Criticality. What do they call it? Right, like system criticality, and then you get new. You collapse back into a new optimum.
Right. Yes. Um, and yeah, so I was going through this state and it was terrifying because I could see myself going through the same process that I had watched my crazy ex go through all those years before. Like it was scarily similar.
Mm.
And very distinctly, the feeling I was having was I was getting all of this stuff coming in through my forehead. And then it felt like it would go down and hit something and pop back out my head. Like it
Mm.
couldn't get through me. And it was creating really manic, really uncomfortable states. And eventually I found out that when this was happening, what I could do was give up. And I would get on my hands and knees. I'd put my knees on the ground and just lay out, with my forehead touching the ground. And for some reason, in that body position of just like, I give up, you know, whatever, go for it. If I'm going to have this experience, I'll have it. I could feel like a trickle going all the way through my body, right? Almost like it was coming down into my legs instead of just like hitting a spot and then regurgitating back out. And again, these were all like very physical sensations. I was in a deep way mapping the experiences directly onto my body and what my
Mm-hmm.
body felt like.
Actually, this
Yeah,
so far this makes total sense to me. Actually, because
perfect. That's rare.
because I have the sense, right, like this rebellious nature, right, like this self-affirmation thing is that's the blockage, right, like
Right.
it's the incapacity to submit, right. And well,
Right.
what's the pose, right, like it's what's it called, plate, not placate, but well, there's this position, right, which you did before the king, right, like so there's
Right.
this pose where you're in some sense completely submitting and there's an actual physicality associated with that, right? Like,
Right.
and you're putting yourself completely under, and that's you giving over, right? Like it's a
Right.
physical expression of you giving over. So that makes total sense to me.
Right. And yeah, what was so strange was how, oh, my internet is getting weird. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, what was so bizarre was just like how direct these physical representation. I mean, it really was. It was like the whole dichotomy between spiritual and physical was just gone. They were like very clearly, directly
Mm.
related to each other. Um, in that state. There was no intellectualism. There was no world of platonic forms. It was like one-to-one mapping between these what had always felt to be disparate worlds. Um, so I started being in that position a lot because it was the only thing that made me feel better. Raining quite heavily. Oh my. And one night in this state, it becomes very intense. And then I have the sense that a being of light descends into my room while I'm in this hands and knees position. And it's a very bizarre feeling because it really felt like I could see it, except I couldn't see it with my eyes. It was like I knew exactly what its shape was, where its outline was, but it wasn't. I don't know how I was perceiving it or how I was. I don't know why it felt so distinct as a separate entity. Um, yeah, it's a bizarre sensation. I don't have
Well,
complete
yeah, but
for it.
like I can imagine it's something new at least, right? So the
Right.
distinctness, yeah.
Yeah, I'd never had anything like that. I still like hadn't touched Christianity in any meaningful way. I'd done some like Joseph Campbell-esque playing around with a couple of the stories, but I still was like had no idea anything about it. I'd never done anything with it in any serious sense. And then I'm having this experience. And the thing says to me, get up, get off your knees. Like, what are you doing? Why are you on your knees? And I thought that was like the weirdest, you know, thing. And I didn't want to get off my knees. Like, I was, in some sense, terrified to do so. So all I did, I stayed on my knees, but like raised my upper body up. And I very much had the sensation of it touching me on the forehead. And then all of a sudden, all of that, like that regurgitating energy I was talking about, that whole thing, suddenly, all at once, goes straight through my body and right out the bottom of my feet. And it was a crazy feeling. It felt like my legs suddenly became alive for like the first time in my life. Like it felt like my nervous system was finally working correctly. And it was
Mm.
such a foreign sensation, but it was very much stuff comes in through the top, through the forehead, and then it rolls all the way down and grounds out through your feet. It reaches down into the ground through your feet. And all of these problems I was having, these psychosis like states, disappear, right? And I could actually handle these large amounts of information or energy coming in without feeling like I was going crazy. So right, that ended. I get touched in the forehead, go through this crazy experience. I kind of come to, and there's no being there anymore or anything like that. But I had this very clear image that I was participating within the Christian story. I just didn't know how or why. um, and so the weirdest part of this whole event is my diabetes goes away. And I'm a type 1 diabetic. It's supposed to be incurable. Your body literally, it's a self autoimmune disorder where your body kills the cells that produce insulin in your pancreas. And I'm measuring my blood sugar regularly. It's staying within healthy levels most of the time, but like I'm like still going to my job making this jewelry. And I start noticing now I'm speeding up the timeline a little bit. Now like weeks are going by. Um, and I'm basically using my diabetes as a measuring tool to see if I can figure out how to live in this new way. Um, so my blood sugar is stable and healthy at normal levels for about 3 weeks. And then after those 3 weeks, it starts wavering, right? And I notice that the wavers take place specifically when I find myself unwilling to submit, right? It's like I'm rebuilding that unhealthy regurgitating pattern instead of, letting things move fluidly through me. Um, so I start using my blood sugar as like a testing, rod to figure out what I'm doing wrong. Like, how do I live in this submitted state? Um, and it doesn't work after about another 3 to 4 weeks. So a total of about a month and a half, I have to take insulin again because my blood sugars are just too unstable.
So um, yeah, I want to touch on this aspect. Were you feeling like you were having granted agency, right? Like, were you in a state of gratitude, or were you in a state of, oh, I'm gonna fix this?
It was an absolute lack of agency that felt like the most agency I had ever had in my life.
Mm-hmm.
That was the correct state. And every time I tried to grip life and control it to what I wanted it to do, I started reforming this really like gross feeling energetic pattern that vomiting it back up.
So
And
so
my
so you
blood
were
sugars would go out.
so you were calibrating your relationship to the, well, is it surrender here? Yeah, I guess it's surrender here.
Right. I would say
Um,
surrender was the right word. And one of the aspects of that experience was basically the way I've come to describe it is it felt like I became part of the revelation of God,
mhm.
right? So instead of me being this individual who's looking at the revelation of God as it unfolds in the world, whether it be through the trees blowing in the wind or the people or whatever, the Bible, any number of things, it felt like I found myself in a state of pure discovery unto myself, right? But only when I was in this submitted state. So by being perfectly submitted, in a sense, or by giving away myself back to God, I found myself as, yeah, part of the revelation. And that was a tremendously, so I had no personal will when I was doing it correctly.
Okay, so is the
Correct.
word witness appropriate here?
Witness is a great word, right? I
Mm-hmm.
was witnessing myself as part of the creation unfolding, but I had no, it's not that familiar self concept of like agency where it's like I'm controlling things and I know who I am. I didn't know who I was. I wasn't, when I was in a healthy state, I wasn't controlling my actions. I was letting the actions happen. And, the weirdest part about all this is just like you're like exuding love, you know, agapic love. It's like, I don't know. I don't know. The words get messy here. by being loved, you cannot help but love in return. And likewise, it never felt like I was loving anything. It felt like the love of God was just pouring through me, and it loved reality. It loved all the people. It loved creation. And I was just kind of like the 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 channel that it took to express itself. But it never once felt like, oh, I love you, or this or whatever. That that barrier of self-concept was like, you know mostly gone. It was very bizarre. Especially, it's just normally, even now, my normal operating state is very much like there's some little homunculus inside me that creates stuff and then expresses it, and I have to like control the homunculus and like make sure he doesn't get too angry, or kind of, kind of the Freudian model of the id, the ego, and the superego. It's this weird layered control system that feels very uncomfortable. That was gone. It was all just one flow through. But I don't know. You can hear it in my words. It gets really hard to describe the experiences in any way that's like meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, were you ever able to recapture that state, or is that just something that comes upon you?
Never like that. At
Mm-hmm.
that, I mean, it was kind of, it was a pretty ridiculous and a long extended experience in that state. And since then, it's definitely way less present, and it mostly comes in little fits. And a lot of that is I've just become so accustomed once again to not submitting.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's not as if it's inaccessible. It is weird, right? Because in some sense, I feel like not submitting ironically comes from um, finding yourself unworthy as opposed to finding yourself too worthy. It's a bit paradoxical, right? Usually people say we would describe it as we refuse to submit because, I'm too good to submit to something else,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in this case, it almost feels like the recognition is I'm too bad to submit to this other thing. Like I don't know. It's almost like, you get the images of the Christians in like the first 600 AD, or maybe 1,000 AD, walking around whipping themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
It becomes like a bizarre sense of self-flagellation as opposed to, I don't know, like, why doesn't submittance feel uh it doesn't feel like a form of flagellation. And instead, it's like I've picked up this horrible, unhealthy practice of just like, well, let me give myself a couple smacks today, and then I don't have to submit, right?
It well, so I guess that brings me to some awe, right? Like maybe you're in a extended state of awe, right? And there's the overwhelming nature of it is in some sense uh, inducing fear, right? Or at least the
Right.
potential.
Um. Yeah. Well, do you mean now, or do you mean in the that extravagant experience?
Well, it's more so your relationship now to potentially going there.
Right. 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 Yes. Perfect. That is exactly the sensation. Yes. Yes. It definitely is a fear of awe, which is ironic. It's just ironic on so many levels. Like, you really start to, I don't know, some of the weirder stories, stuff that turned me away from Christianity when I was a kid or a teenager, and I'm looking at these stories going, what in the hell is that? Like, they just make perfect sense now. Like how ridiculous the types of sins the early stories communicate. They seem so silly, and then like you start having these experiences and it's like, oh, I get how that's working. Like it suddenly makes sense. I don't know, it's very bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. Peugeot had this nice thing that he was talking about where you need to leap of faith to a level. And then when you're in the level, you can start discovering it, but you can't get there through the leap of faith, right? And like sometimes you get smacked onto a level.
Right,
Um,
right.
but 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 yeah, right. It's like, okay, as long as you're not on the level, right? People talking on that level is like, what are they talking about? Like,
Right.
yeah, I don't get it. And I think I've always been trying to describe that as transcending the paradox, right? Where there's these two
Right.
things that can't get together, and it's like, but they can get together here.
Right. That is very true. And you can, yeah, I think that's what I'm struggling about, even trying to describe these experiences, is that they are fundamentally paradoxical in the language I'm trying to use to communicate them with. However, the experience itself is not paradoxical at all. It makes perfect sense. It's a perfect combination of something that just doesn't. The moment you try and say what it is, you end up with these like paradoxes, which is probably true of like all language.
Well, yeah, you're imposing a frame, right? So now you're having a set of constraints, and it's probably not sufficient. Right now, we're getting into
Right.
Gödel's incompleteness.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly it. What we're actually communicating is not the paradox of the experience. What we're actually communicating is the paradox of language itself, and it projects itself onto whatever it is we're trying to talk about. We
Mm-hmm.
start thinking reality is paradoxical when it's not reality, it's the tool we're using to describe reality is has an inherent paradox in it. So
Right,
suddenly everything, if you look at it far enough, looks paradoxical.
well, yeah, or we don't have the participatory underpinning of the language that we're using.
Right. Right. That's a good point too. That's something I always appreciated when I would kind of, dive into some of these words from other languages. Like a big one was Pankaj, which is the word used for the lotus flower in Sanskrit, one of many words. And it literally means mud born. Panka
Mm-hmm.
is just mud, and Ja is born. And I always thought that was so beautiful because they took like the most beautiful flower that they could find, and the word they used to describe it is born of mud, right? So every time you look at it and you say what it is, it brings this view of an entire process
Mm-hmm.
into the name for that object. So right, you cannot talk about the flower without talking about how it's mud,
Yeah, it's
right?
cause, right? Or it's
Right.
precondition. Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
starting point. Yeah, it instead of just seeing this disconnected, disembodied flower floating on top of the stem, you get the image of the entire cycle taking place. That's the pattern that's creating that beautiful flower. Whereas like
Mm.
our object based language, English, you say the word flower, right? It has no process. It has no
Well,
inherent.
actually,
It's just
flowering, there is a little bit process in there, though.
you can add process into it. You can try and make it more obvious, but I would argue the word, unless there's like an etymology to the word flower that I'm just totally unaware of. But you're right, we
Well,
can take a noun and turn it into an adjective, and now we start getting a view of the process taking place.
yeah, yeah, but maybe it's just a consequence of our relationship to the language more so than that's an actual artifact of the language.
I think it's probably a little bit of both. Yeah, I think you're right that if we related to the language differently, we would come up with words that described things differently. I think that's true. However, I think it's also true that the language will impose itself on how we perceive reality, particularly,
Hmm.
in the stages of learning the language.
Right, right, and yeah, and this goes back to, do we have the participatory experience, and are we enchanting the world with it, like with the
Right,
words,
right,
right?
right, right. Yeah,
Because
we would want
if we
our
just
language
learn,
to aid us in the enchantment, not pull us away. Now, of course, there's a lot of use to pulling us away from the enchantment, right? Latin and these heavily object-based languages, these disenchanting languages, gave us a lot of power over the world, you could argue. It makes it a lot easier to manipulate the world because you view everything as mostly meaningless, disconnected parts instead of
well,
processes.
it gives you access to a bunch of intelligibility at once, right? Like, 'cause you can just learn the words on a piece of paper where they're decontextualized, right? Like,
Right,
so they're completely disenchanted. But now you have all of these reference points. So now it's
right,
like, oh, I have this big map, but it's an empty map, right?
right, right. That's exactly it. And it's the irony of like how our culture developed. We got all the power in the world, which we thought would be the enchanting mechanism, right? We thought if I could only have enough power, then I could properly enjoy life.
Yeah.
Hamburgers all day, every day for every meal, and life will truly be great. Uh, but of course, we ended up disenchanting. We lost the enchantment in the process of pursuing it, and now we find ourselves in the meaning crisis.
We find ourselves in cult 4.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Right. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. I forgot we were even going there, but that's exactly what happened. So I took my insulin, and some random crazy dude on Facebook started, you know, um, screwing around with me. I mean, this guy's trolling level was unlike anything I had ever seen anywhere. And during this collapse, I saw something of extreme value in his absolute willingness to totally throw away his his self image. He was not playing an image game the way everyone else was playing an image game. And what I had come to understand was it was my obsession with image games that made it so that I could not stay submitted.
So
And
is image different than identity? Is this like persona instead of identity?
I would say from the way I was experiencing it then, I would say they were the same thing. Image was identity. Because again,
Okay.
I had come to understand the true self is not anything you can ever know.
Hmm.
The true self is where you are partaking in the revelation of God, right? You're in a state of discovery unto yourself in every moment. There is no, secret Charlie Chaplin hiding out inside of you or something, right? There's no homunculus. There's no little completed person sitting inside of you, right? That's just not there. What there is the agapic love of God that creates this endless blooming into reality.
So I've been playing with this idea, right, where we were talking about the words, right, and how they're referencing objects, right? So would you say that the agapic love is process oriented,
Yes,
and it's
absolutely.
the participation in the process oriented state of being?
Right,
Okay.
right. And that's a great way of putting it, because what I'm doing is I'm contrasting that with the concept of the homunculus, which is extremely object oriented, right? It's in some sense this idea that there's a perfect soul, a little piece of God that is our essence, and that we have to uncover or unbury it and then we get to be that completed, perfect little object. I think that's totally wrong. Totally wrong.
Having no.
And I think our language betrays us very deeply at that point.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, crazy, non.
Right.
What's the word? Image. Like so what's image there? Is that the persona? Like is that how he was presenting himself? Or?
Well, it's basically the game that's being played on social media, particularly Facebook, and particularly at this time, which was like late 20, early, mid 2016, I suppose. Is that right? 2015? Damn. My perception of time is terrible.
That's with Trump coming to power, right?
Yes, and this was before Trump. Oh, but Trump came in 2017. 2016 was the last year of Obama. Okay. So the elections were being held, or, all that stuff was going on, but no one had been voted in. That's correct, because the festival I went to put on a giant political ad on every TV screen in the entire place of who's the guy all the hippies like, the socialist? Bernie Sanders. So broadcasting to literally 100,000 people, probably 70% of which are on extreme psychedelic drugs for multiple days. This giant political ad. That was one of the things where I'm like, I even liked Bernie, like I thought he was a cool candidate, and it just felt so gross, like so manipulative. Like, oh, here's your little brainwashing ceremony for all these,
subliminal advertising
right before the election.
You don't remember that you saw the commercial, but it did happen.
It's so weird. But okay, we're getting sidetracked.
We're in Code 4 on Facebook, and this guy is just like,
right. So everyone's playing this game, especially in the New Age circles that I was friends with, where it's like, how enlightened can you appear? And there's all this image crafting that goes into it. You never let an ugly picture on your Facebook. They're all beautiful. They're all taken with like professional lenses where the background is all blurred and you just look blissed out of your mind. Life is perfect and everything's glorious and everything you say is all there is love, and
none of my Facebook.
Good vibes only, and all this just such hokey, sweeter than sweet image crafting. So along in that's the environment. Along comes this guy that's just absolutely brutal and is absolutely honest. So disgustingly honest that he immediately turns most people away. Like they just want to have nothing to do with him. And he knows how to hit the weak points in a person's image. He knows where the cracks are in between this cobbled together, persona. And he knows how to just smack right in the spot where it's gonna hurt the most. And in a way where you can't even take him very seriously. He's just so over the top and ridiculous that you get this bizarre feeling of like, why does such a ridiculous person know every little spot to hit? So I saw a tremendous value in this. One was, oh, well, here's a person that will relentlessly hit every weak point in this persona that I keep trying to cobble together, right? Maybe he can break it faster than I can rebuild it,
Yeah, that's not okay.
And then the other part was just the willingness to be brutally honest, um, and just be totally transparent in a place where everyone is doing their best to not be transparent, and kind of allowing my honesty to destroy my own positive self image of myself, right? If I can be honest, then at least I can deal with it. Whereas if I just am constantly lying about who I am and what I think and all this other stuff, I'll never get anywhere, was kind of the feeling, especially coming down from this, you know, other state that I had experienced. So that was what drew me in. And then my whole life kind of collapsed around me. I left the job, which was its own chaos, chaotic exit, as I am seemingly fond of. And I
You're
kind
one
of
of
took
those
it as a
people
sign, like, well, I guess I better go ahead.
you're one of those people that has an explosion behind them and they just put on the sunglasses.
Yeah, right. Put on the sunglasses while like my back is on fire and I'm like flying through the air. Like wishing I was cooler than I am.
Yeah, yeah.
But
You,
yeah, go ahead.
you get to treat the burns when you're home, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Just make sure the camera's only looking from the front. So yeah, I just kind of took it as like well, I guess I better go figure out what these people are doing. And it was never like I never went into it where I was just like 100% gung ho. It was always this sense of like, I don't know if I'm here because I have something to learn from these people or because I need to destroy what they're doing because it's gross and needs to not exist. Or like, it was always ambiguous, but I did have a lot of fun with it. And then it eventually, about a year and a half later, became very clear that it was no longer ambiguous, and it was something was going wrong, and I left.
So I get the sense that like you're like a spy, right? Where you have your allegiance and then you're infiltrating this place, and then there's these bifurcated allegiance.
Yes, very much. And it's like one of those really good spy stories where the spy themselves is like playing double. They're like they don't know who to help. Like for some reason they start like believing in the thing that's supposed to be their enemy just because they spent so much time with them and like start understanding their motivations and like it gets really convoluted.
But the way you phrased it, you fleed, right? Like you didn't blow it up.
Right. I didn't. No. No, I was too insecure to blow it up. I mean, I that's not entirely fair. I did try and blow it up a little bit when I left, but it was not a serious attempt like other attempts to blow stuff up in my past. And again, this was the fourth cult I had interacted with. The first three, I literally just went in and like wrecked shop.
Mm.
Right? That teenage atheist part of me knew how to find every inconsistency and drive the
The wedge.
worldview against itself.
Mhm. So back to the mold. So you blow out your mold, but you also blow out the mold in the materiality, right? Like in in the world around you as well. So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah, it was always that way. Like I don't think I ever went through a transformation where like my entire life didn't fall apart along with the transformation. Like there was never like a nice gentle transformation where I was able to like adjust myself to the situation I found myself in to begin with. It was always like full meltdown, you know, everything falls apart, and then I'm just like building it back up from scratch was largely the feeling. Again, really ironic because I do feel like a pretty boring person. Like I'm not. I don't know.
You still got a persona, dude.
Yeah, yeah, clearly.
The boring person persona.
Yeah, that's true. There is, yeah, my homunculus is just kind of like, quiet and tired.
I got pacified. Yeah, yeah.
My secret inner self is just, some guy sitting in his chair reading a book, the newspaper. uh,
So how did it jive with your Christianity? Like, were you actively pursuing Christianity as well as the cult? Or...
yes, yeah, yeah. After those, well, that state where I was burning very hot, it just felt like I can't not be a Christian anymore, even if I find myself in extended states where I just don't feel it whatsoever. Like it felt like it just locked it in place somewhere in me, for lack of a better description. Um,
Engraved.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And, even now, like it's been a while where I've accessed anything like a state like that. And in many ways, if you were to ask me, like, do I believe in God and Christ? A major part of me would probably say no, just because it feels disconnected from my experience now. And I'm not quite sure how I fit in relation to that, right? The belief part gets weird. And on the other end, I feel more securely stuck in that world than ever before. It's a really bizarre mixture of seemingly contradictory.
Well, it's the element of interpretation connecting with the experiential element.
Right, right, right. Yeah, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are kind of like, well, my corpus callosum is not doing its heavy lifting currently.
Yeah.
So I kind of
It
flip
might
flop.
get hot again if that ever happens.
Yeah, I know. That's the problem. It's like, oh, I've been cold for a little too long. Something's gonna come. I hope it's when I'm like 50 and not like next year.
So you're now out of the cold. You're entering the Discord space. You're hanging around a bit there. How has that
Uh,
been?
the disc. So when I entered into the or really, Paul's channel, and I did the interviews there,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually that led to the Discord space and all that. The energy I was like this, I was eating an elephant, right? Because that was right. It was not long after I left Cult 4. And
Mm.
when I left Cult 4, I was 99% certain that something was really wrong and it was going to collapse in the same way I'd seen all these other cults collapse. But it hadn't yet. And all the people I'd been interacting with for the last year and a half kept going. So I was in this really insecure state of like, did I make the right choice? Should I have like kept pushing it and, you know, ride it straight into the ground? Or did I, am I just a coward? And that's why I couldn't go as far as I needed to. And I had all these weird insecurities. Now, eventually I became vindicated because it was a total shit show. Went after I left. They were in the process of going from online only to in person. And the moment it was in person, it did every horrible thing you would imagine it would have done. and I dodged that. I had actually learned from the previous three cults to not fall for such clear symbols. But nonetheless, it did. I was in a very insecure state, so I was eating up everything. I came across Jordan Peterson. That was extremely helpful. I came across Paul. I was looking at all this philosophy and it just again trying to like reform a worldview out of this fallout that came from multiple failings at that point. And Discord was perfect for synthesizing that information and making relationships and having these great discussions and kind of like reforming a functional worldview. Um, finding some value in the bullshit I had gone through, where people, at least, if nothing else, other people could delight in the ridiculousness of the story, uh, which was cathartic. It helped. It felt like, okay, at least I
I
can
plead
have fun with
innocence.
it and laugh at it. Um, so yeah, and then eventually I kind of oversaturated the territory and my life has changed quite a bit, and I'm trying to focus on taking care of other stuff right now, so it's just been a kind of a slow slide away, from those areas. I still love to pop in, and it's always a lot of fun. I feel like I have a lot more fun when I do pop in now, because the lengths of time are so long that when I do come in, there's a lot of new
Mm.
information and new stuff, and so I get to get excited about it, and then I just kind of I'll pop in then another 2 to 3 months and get the next catch up.
So basically, you're you're sliding, like you're not doing upkeep. Um, um, you are participating in life.
Right.
So it's like it seems like a cycle somewhere going.
Right. I would agree with that. And it is, I mean, I've made headway. I'm engaged now.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you. Uh, which, my relationships were always really unstable when I was younger, obviously. Um, this is, we've been together for coming up on 8 years now. Been engaged for about 9 months, almost a year, actually, 10 months, something like that. Um, and we're both the same age. We're 32 going on 33 this year. And so it's just kind of like crunch time, It's like if I want to have a family and kids, I need to get my
mm.
shit in order and take it seriously. And if I want to be able to do it doing a skill that I practiced and learned and enjoy, instead of just finding a wage job somewhere, then I need to make sure I'm good at it and cover all those bases. And so that's where my energy's been heavily focused recently, is like trying to get that stuff in order so I can move on to the next stage of life, ideally get out of my Peter Pan,
With your
and that was
knife.
kind of that was part of entering Cult 4,
Uh-huh.
was like, this is my last big, like, I know this is stupid and ridiculous. I was like 26, 27 at the time, and I'm like, all right, this is my last hurrah, like if I'm gonna do this big, like, stupid, let me go take off to Hawaii and live in a shack for, or it was that type of thing. And I'm like, I'm getting too old to keep doing this, so
Hmm.
let me give it a real solid attempt. And if it fails, then I need to like really put a lot of energy into developing the other part. And so that's what I've been trying to do.
So yeah, let me take a stab at your future. So I see yourself. I see you uh, the coming 5 years, right? Like you're busy with hopefully kids, I guess,
That would be ideal. Yeah.
and getting some structure, and then assuming that you get things uh, fall in line, like after 5 years, like you kind of get some rest, maybe, right? And
Yeah.
you can start reorient. You get back to the spiritual aspect, maybe a little bit.
Oh, I'm certain I'm gonna have the worst midlife crisis you've ever seen. But you know, hopefully it's when I'm like 55 or so.
You're gonna do the avoidance trick, okay?
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping. Here's what I'm actually hoping. I'm hoping that there's something legitimately transforming enough about consciously weighting myself and weighting myself in ways
Hmm.
that are more than just like my own self development.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because every time I did it before, it was just, I was kind of in a narcissistic loop. So I'm hoping that this process of marriage and family has something legitimately transforming that doesn't require burning the entire life to the ground in order to,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah, service is the
experience
word there,
change.
right? Like
Right.
living in service, and well, I'm just gonna say probably.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. Yeah. We'll see.
And
It does seem like I'm a an engine that likes to occasionally backfire quite loudly.
make a
And
big
while I can
flash.
hope I've come up with some useful strategies to deal with that by now, uh, who the heck knows?
So yeah, like one of the things that got into me is like, well, yeah, you are quite a grounded person, at least in some ways, right? And um, you you also have a lot of experience to draw upon, right? So yeah, if you're gonna go for kids, right, go for kids. But then at a certain point, I assume that you want to start giving back to
Right.
to the world. So do you have a sense of how that would look like?
Not. I do and I don't. I feel like I don't know. That's a hard question. Bizarrely, I didn't think it would be such a hard question. Maybe I'm trying to escape it. Um, the only state where I felt like I was truly giving back to the world, where it was the thing it's supposed to be, instead of this weird self-serving by helping others thing, was that letting agapic love through me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, at that point, I don't. It's not even giving. It's just like, you know, there's no self effort required on that type of giving. And on the other end, there's the part of me that wants to give back in the sense of like, well, I love teaching. I love helping the people around me navigate their problems. I love being able to share from what I've been able to learn from my rather bizarre little, you know, path. So there's kind of this high ideal form, and then there's the more mild or muted, you know, what are things I enjoy and how do I find value in sharing them with others?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a pretty basic answer, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been having this background sense where there's this like like you're the vessel, right? Like you're the vessel for God's will, in
Right.
some sense, or God's love. That's better than God's will. You're the vessel for God's love, and then you also have to do upkeep on the vessel,
Right.
and I feel like there's a tension there, and it's,
Yeah.
in some sense they're contradictory, right?
Right.
And because the vessel is only so good as what it can hold, right? So
Right.
so you need to cultivate the capacity to hold things, while also being in the expression.
Right. There
And
is a bit of a trick there too, which is to say part of what makes the vessel properly shaped is that the thing is flowing through it,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
In some sense, what makes a tunnel a good tunnel is that it has water always moving through it that flushes out the rocks, right? It carves the tunnel as it's acting in its role as a tunnel,
mhm,
right? And if there's no water flowing through your tunnel, it's just a matter of time until your tunnel becomes a cave,
mhm.
right? It'll clog up, stones will fall, and then it loses the ability to let water move through it at all.
And then that's also true for the air, right? Because if the air ain't moving, it's becoming stale and then can't
Right,
sustain life. So yeah,
right. Yeah, it literally becomes poisonous in that case. Yeah. um, so it is contradictory, and it's also I part of me thinks that the framing, because I do this, I do exactly what you described, where it's like I go through the stage of like let it move through you, and then like oh upkeep, 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 and in some sense I feel like there's a way in which my self-perceived need for upkeep is a way to hide
Mhm.
from the other thing.
Is that spiritual bypassing or is that the opposite? I don't,
I
or
don't know
both.
actually. Yeah. Which direction are you spiritually bypassing?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
uh,
no, I can see that tendency in myself, right? Where I've perceived the need for upkeep in myself so much, right? So that you get in this purity spiral where you're like,
right,
okay, like I need to get rid of like so many things before I can do something. And like at a certain point, it's like, no, like you just need to do it.
right.
Um,
And that's it's so clear telling the story. I should be spending at least 10 minutes a day on my knees with my forehead on the ground.
mhm.
Like it's such a it's such a clear thing. It's such an easy practice, and I've not done it in years. Like like why don't I do that if I know it has a certain positive effect on my life and on my um you know well-being and everything else. It's bizarre, you know at some point I can sit here investigating, well, why don't I do that? I need to fix whatever it is about myself that makes me not, or I can just like shut up and do it, you know
Mhm. That's called yoga.
and by acting it out, I'll learn and remember why it was worth doing. I don't need to figure out what's going on with me. I just need to actually commit to the thing.
Yeah, and it, I think it's also connected to burning of the dead wood, right? Like the less wood you have, the less worry that you like you have to
Right.
care about the dead wood, and the more that you can actually enact things.
A lot
Um,
less tinder uh, to catch fire if a spark does come along.
mhm. So yeah, I guess I want to close off with what do you want to pass on to your children? Like how do you see your experiences inform you educating them?
It's kind of a weird one because I often find that um, the best advice I'm able to give to the people around me, I often find myself in a flow like state
Mhm.
where I'm not even super sure of what I'm saying, and yet it seems to match the situation well. So I guess, see, now I'm a repeating record, saying the same thing in different ways. Um, on the other end, it feels like I've built up a good adjustment for the kind of form of the world today, right? How do you navigate these online spaces? How do you navigate moving in these kind of ethereal realms, and how do you more easily fit them together with physical life? How do you make that boundary seem less dramatic and not in a way where it just makes you easy to manipulate? Um, but again, it's like I have no idea. I have no idea. I would need to know my kid to know how to answer this question, right? It because teaching is not. It's not again. It's not like the homunculus. Like I've got the knowledge and I need
Yeah,
to
but
pass it
I
on.
think
It's
you're going too
how do I
specific.
make the kid better fitted to the world? But in
Hmm.
order to do that, I have to know who the kid is, right?
Well, in some sense, but there's also principles, right? That
That's true.
that
That's true.
you want to connect them to. So it's like, yes, right. You need to give them the light to sprout, right, to
Right.
grow into, but you also have to point them at things. So I'm kind of looking more at that side of the
That
equation.
aspect of it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. it is. It is weird. I didn't think it was so difficult for me to nail down those upper values. I guess in many ways they just kind of follow a lot of the boring Christian prescriptions that you hear, and I think probably why I would have some value is I would know how to breathe some life back
Hmm.
into those prescriptions, make them
Enchant.
exciting or right, enchant them. Right, exactly. Um, yeah, that's most likely. But things like submit, agapic love, right? Like kind of the
Well, yeah. Let's just take
basic.
submit, right? So, because did you know what submittance was before it
No,
got imposed upon you?
no, no, not at all. I thought I did,
Right,
but not
exactly.
like not at all. No.
So how do you teach that, right? Like,
Yeah. Um, I think the best would be try and highlight the paradox, and of course that would be very difficult with a child. Without
so the different way of highlighting the paradox is giving the child the affordance to recognize when it's actually introduced in their lives.
right,
Okay.
right. I think so. There's a simple thing, right? Like no kid wants to do the dishes. At least very few of them do,
Hmm.
right? However, or clean their room. We'll use a Jordan Peterson. That actually that fits perfect. No kid wants to clean their room, right? But in some sense, when you finally do submit to that impetus, the feeling, the rewarding feeling you have on the other end of it is so good, right? That you need to learn that pattern of, I don't really want to do this right now, but I know it's the right thing to do or it's a good thing to do. And I know that there's the reward of it on the other end. Now, that's a little tricky because you can lock yourself into some weird dynamics by framing everything in that way, right? But I think it does communicate that kind of basic principle of what submittance is communicating, right?
Mm.
If you're able to give up some of yourself, you'll find rewards from doing so. It's just they're not rewards you get to claim in your own name, right?
Well,
And it's
that's
that second part that would be the harder part to teach, right? Because most people can understand the first part with if you have them acted out in fairly simple ways. The cleaning the room, the doing the dishes. It's the removing your name from the accomplishment that is a little harder. You know, it's almost where the mystical element of Christianity comes in, right?
Glory
it's not your
be to
name,
God.
it's Christ is the Christian, right?
Okay, that sounds like a good note to end on. Like, is there something that you still feel like you want to add?
I don't think so. Running through that story always kind of scrambles my brain a little, so I feel like I gradually get worse and worse at communicating this
Well,
as it goes on.
you got my
I think
help this time, so that was fine. So yeah, thank you, Nick. That was amazing as always. I want to invite everybody to write their lesson that they took from the story in the comments, so that Nick can get some feedback and that we can see other people and their participation and their insights, because that's also part of this. And we'll see you on the next Unfolding the Soul. Bye.